Hello, and welcome to the Brave New Weed podcast. And now, here's your host, Joe Dolce.
Welcome to the Brave New Weed podcast. This is episode 53. We've been at it now for over 2 years. Very happy to have you this week. And I am really, I know everybody says they're excited about an episode. I am actually really excited to bring you this episode because it features a very special man who's created a very special way for people like you and me, small investors, to invest in the cannabis space, and the money really goes to help other small operators, which is very rare. You know, the banking has locked out people from investing in cannabis and participating in money. So that's what this episode is devoted to, but there's a lot more to come. And I just want you to get ready for it. This episode is also brought to you by Medical Cannabis Mentor, which is an online learning platform with courses for healthcare professionals, that's nurses and doctors, and wellness folks, health coaches, dispensary personnel, otherwise known as bud tenders, and patients. Medical Cannabis Mentor is at www.medicalcannabismentor.com, and you can check it out. And I want to welcome my co-host, Matthew Hendershaw, to this episode. Hello, Matthew.
Hey, Joe. How are you, man?
I'm very good. And, you know, talking about Medical Cannabis Mentor and medical cannabis, I want to ask you a question. And
Sure.
And it's about CBD. You know, our last episode was all about CBD, and it got tremendous response. And people are already we asked people to send in responses of what CBD products they're using that they think are good value and creating good results for them. And we're going to post those recommendations online in the near future. But I wanted to ask you, you've been using CBD now, right?
That's true. Every day.
So how much of that CBD are you using?
I would say right now in the morning, I do about 45 milligrams of CBD in two forms. I do 2 gummies that are 10 milligrams each, and then another 20 to 25 milligrams of sublingual tinctures.
And have you ever tried adjusting that dose? Like, how did you arrive at that dose?
Well, my journey with CBD tinctures started with a standardized dose of 35 milligrams. And that was just where I started off. And I was very comfortable with that. I have regulated downward where I've tried to, when I got these gummies, I would eat a gummy. And I realized that it wasn't really enough. And then looking into it, I was like, oh, these are very actually low dose. They're only 10 milligram gummies. So maybe I'll take a couple more. And that mix and match, I found myself back to that happy place of about 35 to 45 milligrams a day, which seems to work for me for what I want it to do.
And without breaking HIPAA compliance, what do you use it for, Matthew?
Well, I'm a busy guy. I'm running around all the time, and I've struggled for a very long time with stress and low-level generalized anxiety. And what I notice is not so much that this fixes that problem, right? But what I do know is if I miss a day, I will at some point in my day, I will just become aware that I have missed my morning dose because I'll feel stressed out. And I'm like, man, what is going on? I haven't felt like this. And I know what it was. I didn't get my dose this morning of CBD. So that's why I'm maybe a little bit on edge above and beyond what I would normally be.
So what you said is interesting. It doesn't fix the problem, but it helps you deal with the problem somehow. I happen to know why medically because
right.
Do you know how it works? Do you understand the mechanism? It's quite interesting.
Well, yeah, I do. Obviously we had guests on our show, and Dr. Chen has explained it several times as well about the way that CBD interacts with inflammation and how even as much as we like to think that anxiety and inflammation are not connected, they absolutely are connected in the human body. Stressors and body responses and all of that stuff. It's all one working machine.
Actually, there's a specific mechanism I'll share, which is that we produce this stuff called GABA, and GABA lowers our fight or flight mechanism, which is controlled by cortisol. And CBD actually works to up the output of GABA so that the cortisol response is lowered, which is actually very interesting, right? It's basically saying you get an extra breath, you get an extra beat before you jump right into that stress response. And I'm asking these questions because I find that we don't know enough about how one doses CBD, right? And where you did the right thing. You played with the dose, you upped it, you lowered it, you adjusted it, and now you're at a place where you're comfortable with it and it seems to be effective. Correct?
Yeah. And I've also, you traverse from this maker to this maker to this product. And I've had some products that I don't think that this is working for me. And I've had other products that I'm like, this is exactly what I'm looking for, but it's a little bit more expensive than I'm ready to invest in on a regular budget.
Yeah, it can be very expensive. So that's what's interesting, and that's why I think the idea of Medical Cannabis Mentor, which is actually telling people and showing people how to adjust dosages and how to find the right place, is a very important thing. Obviously, I think it's important because I created it, but thank you for sharing your experience with it. I don't think your experience is atypical. I think most people don't understand that this is a botanical medicine and that you have to adjust those doses and you have to experiment with it on your own to find the right place.
Well, and it's also just a very, very different thing than whole plant cannabis when you're talking about THC, because obviously those effects are immediately noticeable. Like you sit down, you smoke a joint, you're high. You can one-to-one compare that. And CBD, it doesn't really work that way because it doesn't give you these effects. I've had some other people talk to me about this as well that I've explained my CBD dosages with and what I use it for. And it's just sort of noticing that the thing is not there versus...
It's an absence. Yeah, it's often an absence of stress or an absence of that response, right? It's very interesting. Yeah.
Yes.
And you have to actually, what you say is really, really smart because you have to say to people, notice what's not happening. Right?
Yeah.
Notice that your stress is not happening. Notice that churning in your mind is not happening to the same extent. It has to be articulated. It's not adding something on top of. It's maybe even removing something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, I can 100% agree with that statement.
So interesting. Thank you for sharing. I want to, in this episode, I want to give a little less time to the news and a little more time to a very special arts segment we have on something called the Spliff Fest. But before you do that, is there any news, Matthew, that you thought was absolutely burning that we needed to discuss this week?
It's been obviously the same stuff. Will they or won't they on legalization all across the states and a little bit globally as well. But there was one thing that jumped out at me that I'm very happy to be able to share. Obviously, our listeners know that not too long ago, about half a year, I relocated to Germany. And last month, it was officially announced that the first cannabis made in Germany will be produced starting next year in 2020. So the tender includes a total of 10,000 kilograms of cannabis that can legally be grown and then distributed into the medical markets. And they are very, very happy to be able to slap the brand name of Made in Germany right on the side of it.
Congratulations. It's going to be technically amazing, I'm sure.
I think Germany...
The most precise cannabis ever created.
Obviously, the medical program here is super, super strong, but everything has to come from outside the country at this point. So moving that in is a big step for this country to, on the road, which will be long for Germany, I think, to full legalization, but it's a start.
Quick question. Does German health insurance cover medical cannabis?
Actually, yes. There was a big thing last year because last year was the first year that insurance was really involved in this. And the statistics were really astounding. Many, many people were filing claims to get their insurance to cover their medical cannabis. And insurance companies were covering it, especially state-run. The insurance systems here, it's a little tricky. It's kind of complicated. There's private insurance, but there's also public available insurance. And a lot of the public available insurance does, in fact, cover cannabis if you get a prescription from a qualified medical practitioner. Another funny tidbit about this, you know how you have to put a maximum on a prescription?
Yes.
Would you like to guess the monthly, like 30-day maximum of the allotment of cannabis that you can get with a medical prescription in Germany, Joe?
100 grams.
100 grams a month.
Is that right? Am I right?
That is absolutely correct.
They copied the Israeli model. That's exactly what they do in Israel. 100 grams. That's why.
100 grams. That is so much for a 30-day period.
For Americans, that's about 3 ounces. Yeah.
More. Yeah.
Right?
Can you imagine going through that by yourself in a 30-day period?
I could imagine it if I had a very serious illness. Absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's terrific. Congratulations, Germany, for getting on board. Subnote is I actually think the German insurance model is one that America should adopt. It's an easier thing. It's easier than healthcare for all. We'll talk about that another time. We're going to talk about that another time, but I think it's an easy model for Americans to adapt to, even politicians.
Listeners, you can join the conversation with Brave New Weed today by visiting us on any of our social media platforms. Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all at Brave New Weed, will bring you to a place where you can like, comment, share the show, interact with other listeners, and keep the conversation going. Together, we are the world of Brave New Weed.
I want to tell you first, our first interview is, it was so great. It is on the Spliff Film Festival, which is advertised as a film festival by the stoned for the stoned, which I actually think is a terrible advertisement.
Yeah, we don't want to be.
I really can't take any more Cheech and Chong movies. And the fact is that the films I saw in this festival in San Francisco last week were really across the board and really fantastic. And there was some great irony and some great humor and really some fantastic parody that really, I would say, upped the level of a festival called the Spliff Fest. It's brought to you by our wonderful friends at The Stranger, which is an alternative weekly that's doing gangbusters out of Seattle. And the curator is one of my favorite commentators, who's Dan Savage, who is just a provocateur, writer excellence, obviously a great curator. And someone whose finger always just seems to be on the beat. So our first interview is with the marketing director of the Spliff Film Festival. Have a listen. So Caroline Dodge, the marketing director of the Spliff Film Festival. Welcome to the Brave New Weed podcast, Caroline.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
I want to tell the audience how I came across this festival. I was in San Francisco and I went to another festival which was called the Hump Film Festival, which was, to me, maybe the best hour and a half I've spent in the cinema in a very long time. It is, correct me if I'm wrong, it's amateur porn that has been done for about 10 years, and it's curated by one of my favorite writers, Dan Savage, actually one of my favorite activists, Dan Savage. Actually, probably one of my favorite people if I knew him, Dan Savage. Would you just tell the listeners quickly about the Hump Festival and how it led into the Spliff Festival, please?
Sure. So Dan Savage has actually been running the Hump Film Festival for almost 15 years.
Whoa.
And it started out in Seattle at the Alt Weekly, where he is one of the editors. 15 years ago, sitting around as one does when you are writing a paper and coming up and brainstorming ideas. And he said, wouldn't it be funny if we threw a festival and asked people to put in all of their amateur porn? And we thought, okay, well, let's give it a try. And wouldn't it be funny if we called it something like Hump? And it really was just laughing about the idea of a porn festival named Hump. And we threw it out there to our Seattle readers, and they sent us so much smut, more than we ever had thought could ever happen. And then we thought, oh, God, I wonder if anybody's even going to come to this. And that was when we were really blown away, because we just could not, we couldn't do enough shows. They were just kept selling out. And so now we've kind of caught our stride and stretched it to Portland, which has the Stranger's city paper, sister paper, the Portland Mercury. And then we just started going around the country. And now we take the festival to almost 50 cities, and we get dirty movies from all around the world.
Well, what I loved about it was a couple of things. First of all, that no porn film is more than 5 minutes, which is what I think all porn films should be. Secondly, that a lot of them were really funny and had humor, which I think sex really needs to be funny. Third, they had stories, which most regular old porn doesn't have. And fourth, that you can't see it online. You can only see it in a theater to really protect people's privacy and to let them actually get out there and show cocks and pussies and all the other things they want to show. But the narrative structure was pretty amazing, I have to say. So thank you for bringing it to my attention.
You're so welcome. We're so proud of it. And we love newcomers. Half of our audiences around the country and Canada are brand new. And so it's one of those great things that Facebook deactivated the business account for it. So
those fuckers at Facebook. What are we going to say?
Well, and as we push into the Spliff Film Festival, Facebook rejects almost all of our Facebook ads for Spliff as well. So sex and drugs, it's a tricky business.
I know. That's one reason I want you here. I want to tell people about the Spliff Festival. So how did Hump give way to Spliff?
The exact same thing of people sitting around, a whole bunch of friends sitting around laughing and saying, wouldn't it be funny if we did a Hump style film festival where we asked people to send in stoner movies, homemade stoner movies, and ask them to be as weird as they want, as funny as they want, as smart as they want. We asked for, sort of Cheech and Chong silliness, but we asked for trippy visuals. We asked for, sort of Broad City style buddy films. We asked for documentaries about cannabis. We just wanted
you got a mix, I have to say. I mean, some of them appeal to me more than others. I'll be frank in my critique, as I want to be. I thought that a lot of them went beyond the typical stoner jokes and tropes, which I thought was great. I mean, I've watched that shit for 40 years and I'm sort of over it. Some of my favorites were ASMR candy sandwiches. Tell the audience what ASMR is, because I keep hearing it on the West Coast and I had never heard it on the East Coast. That's because I'm very sheltered.
So I'm embarrassed to say that I don't know exactly what ASMR stands for. We can look that up later, but it is basically this. It's this popular. It's basically a YouTube style videos where people speak very succinctly, and I could sit here and do it for you, but it's basically getting it close to the microphone, and it's this sensory. It's like sensory porn, honestly.
Autonomous sensory meridian response. It's basically listening to the crinkling of a candy being unwrapped, or the hiss of a whisper. It's sound porn. Exactly. Loved that. I thought that was hilarious. These two women are making candy sandwiches, which really is such a thing. One of my favorites was also, it was called The Girl Who Couldn't Get High, and it was about the tragic disorder and the devastating consequences of those close to her because she couldn't get high. That was a complete work of genius, I thought. Did you enjoy that one?
I loved it. Almost a cautionary tale. I know, and there are lots of ones that, in my opinion, that were like that, were just very kind of clever. And we got over 250 submissions.
That's fantastic. I'll tell you, another favorite of mine was called BBHMM Blunt by a woman named Kenya Kush, and that stands for "Bitch Better Have My Money."
And
the weed you put in that blunt to get your money better smell like diamonds or pearls, which I loved. She was like my favorite Beyonce in a long time, I have to say.
We fell in love with her.
Who curates?
Well, Dan Savage curates. And it was a group of about 5 or 6 of us from that ran the spectrum from people who smoke weed to people who do not smoke weed, to film geeks. And they're all mostly friends of the paper. And the paper meaning the Stranger newspaper in Seattle. And it was a lot of the same folks who put together Hump.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And what is the qualifications you guys are looking for in Spliff? Tell our audience what they're likely to get and see.
It's so funny that you say that, because we all met at 8 a.m. when we found out that we had 250 submissions that we had to go through. And I mean, I just sort of asked it very innocently, like, so guys, what are we looking for? Because it was our first year, and we really didn't know what we were going to get. And so the answer was, I don't know. We will know when we see it. And we all basically had a big shared Google Doc that we all sat with. Everybody just had the same document in front of them. And as the film would play, we would all write notes and write either yes, no, maybe. And you could see along the line who was saying yes, who was saying no immediately, who was saying maybe. And then we would just sort of talk out loud.
About what you liked.
A lot of people getting stoned throughout, a lot of us not getting stoned, wanting to really sort of see things as clearly and I don't know, just as authentically as possible.
So you're not a cannabist. You're not a regular cannabis consumer.
I am, but I am not when I'm doing business. Honestly, I really wanted to have as clear a head as I could.
So what did you like about the festival? Because it is, I do think it's a mixed bag, and it is different. I mean, it's weird. We're at this inflection point in a way where this is all getting normalized and mainstreamed. Yeah. And the not to be too analytical about it, but the definition of what counts as stoner humor is broadening, or maybe that term stoner humor is going to go the way of the dodo bird. I don't know. What do you think this tells you about where stoner culture, forget that, where cannabis culture is today?
Yeah. So I think that's a really great question. And the reason I think so is because I was so worried about getting submissions. I spent so much of my outreach and promotions working with other film festivals, with filmmakers. And I was so confident that everybody would want to come to this, that we weren't going to have problems selling tickets. I certainly had budget for marketing it, but we actually had problems. Like, we did not have full houses for Spliff in Denver, in Seattle, and in Portland. I mean, we had good houses, but I didn't think that I thought we would sell out for sure. And I think your question sort of lends itself to the notion that I think people are tired of those tropes. And I think that people were like, oh, I can get stoned and watch something on my couch. Or oh, it's just going to be some sort of Cheech and Chong, Pineapple Express kind of film festival. And now that we've seen it, and now that we know what we know, we're going to be able to ask very specifically about things that we want. We've had a survey in all of our for all of our screenings, so that we get feedback from people to see what they want, what they liked most, and then also just the idea of people being able to see this and then go out and say, oh, you know what? I think this should have more of this. I think there needs to be more of this in it.
So here's how I wrote about it when I was thinking about it. I said, typically the stoner Pineapple Express jokes and tropes are centered around weed being the inside of the joke. Mm-hmm. And the ones I like the most is where that's not the case. Mm-hmm. It's not about like weed and being stupid on weed, because that's really easy to do, by the way, and we've seen that time and time again. Right. It's trying to go beyond that, I think, and trying to look at the culture in general, and with probably a certain slanted eye. That was one way I thought about trying to describe what the next level of stoner humor or cannabis humor might be.
Yeah. Or like did you see Smokescreen, the one of the date, the woman who goes on all of the different dates and ends up getting trapped in the online dating?
Was that the sort of soft porn one?
No. So that
No,
one
I
might
don't.
have been one that you missed.
Yeah.
It to me was a perfect example of one that was not about the weed, that the weed sort of takes second place in it, but it definitely plays a role. But it's not the weed dictating
Okay.
the topic of the film. So
Okay, great. So because Facebook is making it very difficult to promote things like cannabis, I'm sure Mark Zuckerberg has never
I know.
smoked a joint or
Oh.
ever used a substance that's illegal, by the way. Nor anybody who works for him.
Right.
I'm sure none of them have any relationship to cannabis. Okay, I put that little dig in there. But how can people see this? Where do you go? How do they get access to it? Tell us.
At this point, we will be we are doing the show in San Francisco this weekend, and then after that, we're going to be sort of holding back and seeing where we're going to take it on tour in the fall. Possibly Albuquerque, New Mexico, possibly Los Angeles. We're thinking about going maybe to smaller towns where there is stoner culture, but maybe it's not so saturated by weed activities. We're not sure. We're a little bit flummoxed now on where to take it. We know that Portland and Seattle are our home bases,
Yes.
and with Hump, we really took maybe almost a decade to really kind of marinate the brand of it and really figure out what it is. And we may do that with San Francisco, Seattle, and Portland, which are sort of our big markets and big Dan markets.
So let me invite the listeners. If any of you want to bring this to your towns or have an inkling of where Caroline and the Spliff Fests can come, how would they reach you? How would they find you?
At spliffilmfest.com, which is a clunky URL because it has 3 F's right in the
And
middle of
lots of S's. Yeah.
But
Triple F.
Triple F spliffilmfest.com. You can contact us at info@filmfest.com. Tell us where you are. Tell us why you think we should come to you. And we are always open to explore new cities. And we'll take Hump there with us.
Thank you so much, Carolyn Dodge, and thank you so much for sharing both Hump and Spliff Film Festivals with me. I thought they were both delightful.
Thank you so much, Joe.
Our main interview this episode is with Seke Ballard, who is the founder and the manager of a fund called Good Tree Capital. And as I said in the beginning of this episode, the reason we're talking to Seke is we got some blowback on a great interview we do with Rich Batenburg, who runs another incredible investment fund out of Colorado, but which requires $1 million in liquid assets. And a lot of our readers, pushed back and said, that's delightful, but really get real. We don't have it. What can we do? So came across Seke and his fund, which is a fantastic model. It's a lending institution that raises money from individual investors, and they can be small investors. You don't need $1 million for this. You don't even need $10,000 for this. You have to be qualified. You put your money in this fund, and then Seke distributes that fund to vetted, smaller operators in the cannabis space, which really enables them to get access to money. As you may or may not know, banking regulations will not deal with anyone in the cannabis industry. And if you read the blog on this, you'll see that my own personal experience about that. So we're really cut off from, even if you don't touch the plant, you are completely cut off from access to capital, which makes growth near impossible unless you're raising money on your own. So this is a fantastic alternative. And Seke is an incredible guy. He's a Harvard graduate who worked for Procter & Gamble as well as for Amazon and really learned the ropes of how to do this, and is now bringing this forth into the world. So I really advise you to listen to this, listen to what he has to say, and if you're interested, it's called Good Tree Capital, and you can find it online, and the web address is within the interview. Have a listen. Hi, Seke.
Hi, Joe.
Thanks for joining me today. Here in San Francisco, in the offices of Meadow.
I am.
It's pretty nice here, isn't it?
It really is. I love the energy. Got to sample some coated marshmallows.
Mellows, they're called. They're David's wife, Stephanie, who has edible, delicious luxury, not luxury, just delicious edibles.
Uh-huh. Well, I'm going to feel mellowed in a
You
couple
are.
hours.
Yeah, they're delicious. And they come in gift boxes also, which I think is like the best gift you can give to anybody.
yeah, I agree.
No, it's a really beautiful little thing. Makes every housewarming a little bit warmer.
It's not just something delicious to eat, it's also a gift.
It can be a gift, exactly. So I want to talk to you about your business, Good Tree Capital. Everybody here who listens to this podcast knows that I am not a businessman, even though I may start and run companies for better or for worse. Is not what I do. So I want to talk about it on a level that's quite broad, actually, but explains how you work, why you do it, how you got into it, really. And talk about who might want to invest in it. We recently did a podcast where we talked to a great guy, Rich Batenburg, who runs a very high a fund for very high net worth people. You need over $1 million. And quite a few people said to us, Joe, that's great, but how about for us who
Not very accessible.
We don't have that. Mm-hmm. What else can we do here? What else is on? So I wanted to sort of talk to you about that and talk about it from different perspectives and see how it is. Okay. So
let me start with explaining the problem and how Good Tree Capital is structured to solve that problem, and then how investors broadly can participate in that. So at this point, cannabis has been legalized in over 30 states, either for adult use recreational purposes or medicinal purposes. But at the same time, the federal government continues to prohibit cannabis as a Schedule I drug, alongside the likes of heroin and methamphetamines. This creates some pretty interesting downstream impacts for the industry. The most interesting of which is access to financial services. So if you look across the nation at all of the licensees, these are people who've gone through the pretty arduous process of getting licensing from their state. 80% of the people who touch the plant don't have bank accounts. The reason that happens is because banks at large, being FDIC insured, are more sensitive to the federal stance on the industry. And so they've taken a arm's length sort of relationship with the industry. If you sort of double click on the fact that 80% of licensees don't have accounts for their businesses at banks, you got to think about what is the chief product that a bank provides. So, they take your dollars either in a savings account or checking account. They pay you some crappy interest rate on it. They then use that money to lend out to small businesses or large businesses at a higher interest rate, and they bank the spread. So if a bank isn't providing you with an account, that means you also don't have access to debt capital.
The spread is not going to be yours.
Yeah. Right, exactly. They're not interested in the spread for the cannabis industry. And so this is a pretty big problem, because no matter what business you're in, whether you are, a restaurant, you're some bodega on a corner, or you're WeWork or Amazon or Google, doesn't matter what business, how large you are, there are really only three ways to finance growth. Either you are making profits significant enough to reinvest into whatever growth opportunity you've identified, or you sell equity in your company. So someone gives you money in exchange for ownership in your company. And then the third way is debt. So, if you want to grow one of those three or some combination of the three, the problem for cannabis is that there's a gaping hole in the financing equation for the industry. They don't have access to debt. So Good Tree Capital, we come in and we first say that we're not a bank. So that means we're not subject to the same regulatory overhang that banks are typically subject to. So we then raise money from investors across the country, accredited investors across the country, that's then pooled into a fund and loaned out to vetted cannabis companies, licensed cannabis companies across the nation. You asked the question about how do people get involved. At this stage...
Wait, hold on. You just said a lot. Oh, I have a few questions. Sorry. Hold on. So you're not a bank. What are you, a lending institution?
We're a lender.
A lender. Mm-hmm. Okay. So Do you have a lot of? How old are you, by the way?
35.
No. How old's your company?
Oh, we started in December of 2015. We spent the next year and a half building out our algorithm, and this is the algorithm we use to determine the creditworthiness of people who apply for loans on our site.
It's an algorithm.
I'm sorry?
It's an algorithm.
It's an algorithm.
Infallible algorithm?
Of course not. None of them are.
I know.
And we're constantly learning new ways to make it stronger and more predictive.
And that's to vet the people who are applying for the loans?
Exactly. Because ultimately, this is how we protect our investors' money. We have to feel very confident that we are doling out loans to companies that are ultimately, going to pay those loans back. And if we get that wrong, then the equation for how we deliver returns to our investors, it's undermined, it's jeopardized because of it.
So before we go on, there's many things to talk about. Can you just explain to us who you are? Tell the listeners how you got into this, what you were doing beforehand. Are you a cannabist? Do you enjoy cannabis?
I do. You want to start from the beginning, from when I popped out of my mom's womb?
I don't want to start that long ago, no. We could do that another time, perhaps. No, I'd like you sort of just tell us how you sort of got into the world of cannabis, because I know you haven't been there for that long, so tell me everything.
I haven't been. Well, I have my MBA. I graduated from Harvard Business School in 2010. After that, went to Procter & Gamble, where I did corporate finance for a couple years, and that was around 2012 when Amazon recruited me. So I worked there for about 4 years, and really, that was the birth of my interest in cannabis as an industry, as a legalized industry. I started at Amazon in 2012, which was the same year that Washington State and Colorado legalized for adult use. And so I had basically a front row seat to all the growing pains of this new sort of fledgling industry that would eventually become legalized in over 30 states.
What were you doing in Amazon?
So my last job at Amazon, I was responsible for building out their private label consumables business. So things that you might find in a grocery store. Amazon wanted to build its own brand and make that a part of its product assortment for.
And you were creating that?
And I was creating that.
You made a lot of money for Jeff Bezos, didn't you?
As if he needs any more.
I mean, you made him a shitload of cash, did you not?
I like to think that I did. And Amazon compensated me incredibly well for the work that I did.
Good.
I had a great experience at Amazon. They taught me a lot. The culture at Amazon is a culture that I like to build in my own company.
What about it did you like?
So Amazon has this, it's called the leadership principles. And everything is evaluated through the prism of the leadership principles, and they include things like customer obsession, and bias for action, and so when we're hiring people at Amazon, it was, do these people meet our bar for obsession of the customer and what the customer needs and what the customer is looking for in products, and so I think it is a big part of the reason Amazon has earned the success that it's earned to this point. And it's, again, a part of the ethos that I'd love to carry on in everything that I do.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. So there you were at Amazon.
There I was.
There was the opportunity in cannabis. You're not a finance guy?
Well, I did corporate finance for a couple of years. And then, with the finance training from getting my MBA, I learned, I'd like to say, just enough to be successful, managing a vast array of different sort of financial endeavors. But lending is pretty simple. It's an age-old business. It's not that complicated.
It's so age-old, indeed. Indeed. So if I'm, a couple of ways, if I need the money from you, I'm a small business, how does it work for me? So I get approved? How much does it cost? What's the deal? How much can I take? How long does it take? Go on.
So let's say you're a cannabis company. And usually when licensed cannabis companies, when they're looking for money to invest in growth or what have you, they start Googling. And they might Google something like cannabis loan, cannabis financing. And the hope is that we pop up first in whatever search they do. And then they go to our website which is www.goodtree.capital. Once they're convinced of whether or not they'd like to get financing from us, they just press the button, apply now. The application takes less than 10 minutes to fill out. We give them either rejection or provisional approval instantly. If you are provisionally approved, then that's when it becomes a little bit more manual. So me or someone from my team will reach out to the provisionally approved applicant and ask for corroborating documents to make sure what they said in the application is true. If that checks out, we originate the loan in as little as a week. Our average loan size is around $67,000, $68,000, although we've made loans as large as $250,000. The interest rate on average is around 15.5%, but it could be as low as 12%.
So some people in California tell us that's a good rate because here that loan would cost 20 to 25%.
Right. I mean, you know, not to be too, on the nose about it, but there are a lot of sharks out there, and they recognize the precarious position that, licensed companies are in financially, and they charge a really, really big premium to help them get out of that situation. But we don't like to think of our borrowers that way, as just a source to make a lot of money because they're in a tough situation. We like to think of them as people that we'd like to have a long-term relationship with. As they grow and need additional capital, we want to be the people that they come to, so we don't charge them insane rates for it.
So how big is your fund, the lending fund?
Yeah, so right now we have $2.5 million committed, thanks to a pretty large investment from an investor that shall not be named, but we get a pretty good amount of support in the less than 2 years that we've been active. So we raised our first fund in Q1 of 2017. We made our first loan in October 2017. And since then, with our ability to return 28.7% to our investors, they've
28.7%
over a 3-year horizon. Yes, 28.7%.
Is that guaranteed?
Nothing is guaranteed in life.
That's right.
Except a little base.
That's a little philosophical moment there.
I like philosophy. I have air quotes undeclared minor in philosophy. But yeah, 28.7% over a 3-year horizon. I lost my train of thought.
Sorry for interrupting you.
Don't worry about it.
We were just talking about what I was going to say. What's the upside to an investor, or what does the investor get out of this?
I have this image of, a husband and a wife, or a husband and a husband and a wife sitting at their table, reading the news or watching television, witnessing the massive growth of this industry. But not really having an accessible way to invest in that growth because, not everybody sees themselves as a pot shop owner or a farmer growing weed. And so I think of this as an accessible way for people to invest in cannabis over a short window of time, 3-year horizon, and get a pretty healthy return, 28.7% at a risk level that's really low. So all of our loans are secured by the assets of the business, as well as personally guaranteed by the CEO or the owner of the business. These are for the borrower. So if I lend money to borrower X, that company's assets is what's going to secure that loan. So, this is 28.7% for a really, really secure investment. And so I think it works for all parties involved. Investors get good returns at a relatively low risk way. Borrowers get access to capital when they otherwise wouldn't have had access to capital. And Good Tree Capital benefits because we take a fee off of what's being invested.
And how is it? So let's say legalization were to occur in the next couple of years. That changes things for you dramatically, would it not? Yeah. How do you see you sort of competing against a bank who's going to come into this market with shitloads of marketing and dollars, and you're quite small. How's this going to work?
Yeah, it's sort of like David and Goliath.
Yeah,
which I have in my mind.
I'd say so.
I'm working on building my slingshot right now, and I think there are really 3 things that make us competitive in the long term. Number one is the future. Number two is the cost of doing business. And number three, I think, is the requirement that we have niche solutions for this industry. So I'll dive into each of those. My conception of the future is that banks in 10, 15 years look a lot more like Goodtree Capital than they do Bank of America. I think the model for how people engage with banking is changing in some pretty fundamental ways.
Seems to me.
I don't have a great degree of confidence that the more traditional players in this industry are going to be able to adapt as quickly as the newer financial technology companies out there. So we are building our lending platform in a way that focuses on the user experience, that focuses on automating really essential parts of the process. And that focus on automation segues into the second reason, which is the cost of doing business. So you have banks that hire armies of loan officers and loan committees who work out of this extensive network of branches, brick and mortar branches. All of this creates some really high cost for the bank, and the bank then has to pass those costs on to people that they're doing business with. So that's just if things are normal. Because we're in the cannabis industry, things are not normal. So that means on top of that, the bank has to account for compliance requirements at the federal level. So, I won't go too much in depth with this, but there's something called the Cole Memo that was put out by the Obama administration.
We know
years
it well,
ago.
yes.
And even though Jeff Sessions sort of did a 180 from the Cole Memo, banks still use this as a rubric for how they do business with the cannabis industry, if they do business with the cannabis industry. And this adds cost. And so you'll have cannabis companies that are paying 2, 3, 4, 5% of revenue just to have an account with the bank, which is
just to have an account.
Just to have an account. Just to have a place to hold your money, to be able to, make payroll electronically and to be able to pay your suppliers electronically. I think it's highway robbery. I don't anticipate that will change in the future. I believe that banks, the cost structure and the fees that they will charge their clients are going to continue to be high. It costs the bank on average 5.8% of principal to originate a loan. It costs me 0.5% of principal to originate that same loan. So I think in the long term, we'll be pretty competitive from a cost perspective. And then the third reason, this is a unique niche industry that requires unique niche solutions. I don't see a Bank of America being able to really understand, the intricacies of what it means to do business in cannabis. I mean, maybe they might invest, but I don't see banks writ large, en masse, being able to fashion products and a way of speaking to the cannabis industry.
You don't think so?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think they would deploy the tools that they use for all other small business lending, for cannabis specifically. And I'll just this is a dumb example, but let's just think about cultivation and the state of cultivation depending on what state you're in. So I was just in Eugene, Oregon, and in Eugene, Oregon, they're selling dollar grams. You can find a pound of dirt weed for a couple $100 there. Whereas if you go to Massachusetts, where the supply is a lot more restricted in Massachusetts, that same pound of weed is going from anywhere from $4,000 to $6,000. And so this is a trivial nuance of how cannabis is a different beast unto itself. And then not only that, but it's a different beast based on the state that you're operating in.
And the climate you're operating in, literally. Yes.
In California, at least at the local level, the regulations are still sort of in flux. They're not yet defined. And so unless these banks are willing to hire people that are becoming experts in the industry by municipality, by state, and then eventually across states, I just don't see that they will be able to connect with borrowers and connect with investors in the same way that we're looking to connect with investors and connect with borrowers.
So here you are, a tiny company. How are you going to market this? How are you going to tell people about this? I mean, I know you have competition. Very little. So on the national level or on the local level?
On both. So, earlier I was saying, banks, let's just get away from the cannabis industry. Banks are the chief source of debt capital in this country and everywhere. They supply upwards of 3/4 of all debt in the nation. So if you remove their participation, then that means there's really virtually no debt out. I mean, there's debt out there. There are people who are providing it, but not, at mass or at scale. And so right now it's a lot of white space. And that's actually what makes Good Tree Capital's model so attractive, because we don't have a great deal of competition right now, which means we can charge certain interest rates with our borrowers that then allows us to return the 28.7% that we're able to return to investors. There's a handful of people out there, of lenders, maybe 5 pure play lenders just for cannabis, but they don't put a focus on automation. So if you wanted to apply for a loan on their site, you wouldn't be able to do that. You'd have to contact them manually. The user experience isn't as modern as I think what we're trying to build. And so I think right now it's open season. It's anybody's business. And I estimate that there's $1 billion in unmet demand for debt capital. And I think if Good Tree Capital is even able to pull a small fraction of that amount, our investors will feel very successful.
Is there an ethical basis for Good Tree Capital? I mean, is there since you like philosophy, and since we like the ethical cannabis, David calls it good cannabis.
Good cannabis.
Hua calls it good cannabis. Yeah, that we sort of like that idea.
Yeah.
Because going forward, it's sort of rooted in a good past, I think.
Well, there is, but it's a long story. Are you prepared? I'll try to make it as short as possible.
Your ethical? You mean your ethical basis?
Ethical component, yeah.
Yeah, sure.
So,
I mean, I don't think it matters to a money person.
Yeah,
but it sort of matters to me to know you, to understand what you're doing in your business.
Right. So summer 2015, Dylan Roof went into a church in Charleston, South Carolina, and he killed 9 people in their place of worship. My mother's side of the family comes from Charleston, so this was something that hit, close to home for our family. My mom passed away in 2013. So my dad, he's 80, sent me an 80-year-old man's text. And he said, we should go to Charleston and pay our respects at the church. And so we live in Wilmington, North Carolina. Charleston is maybe a 10-hour round trip. So I was in Seattle at the time working at Amazon. So I flew home. My dad and I took this long road trip. And because of the gravity of, I guess, the trip where we were going, we had a pretty interesting discussion during the car ride home. And I would say the question that animated the majority of the car ride was, what did your generation do wrong? This is me asking him what his generation did wrong, because I don't know, here we are going to this place where people were killed in their place of worship. It just seems, fundamentally wrong. It feels like what I read about in the history books about Jim Crow. And so he did some thinking, and he believed that his generation failed to secure the economic foundation of the African American community. He believes that it was the unfinished business of the civil rights movement. And he used himself as a case in point for why he believed that was true. So when I was a kid, my dad owned a pulpwood logging company. So he'd go around, he'd cut down trees and sell it to the local mill. We had maybe 3 or 4 18-wheelers, a couple tractors, 15 to 20 people working for him. This was your quintessential small business going concern for much of my childhood. And he told me that he applied for 13 loans and was rejected by every single bank for every single loan. And his hypothesis was that it didn't have to do with the merit of the business and its performance, but instead, the color of the skin. And, me being naive I'm so embarrassed to admit this, but
thank you for doing that.
That little equal sign that you see on the bottom of emails from Wells Fargo or Bank of America, or equal opportunity. I thought, well, that can't be true because there are laws in the books, and this is what's at the bottom of those emails, and so you must be wrong about that. And so after the trip,
you said that,
and I didn't say it.
Okay.
I only thought it. Because I'm not stupid. I wouldn't say that about that. So I went back to Seattle, did some research, and it turns out that that's true. So I, an African American man, if I go into a bank, white guy goes into a bank, we have the exact same credit profile, wealth profile, educational background. We're the same person, really. The only difference is the color of our skin. I am 2.2 times more likely to be rejected for a loan. And in the event that I get a loan, I'm going to pay on average 180 basis points or 1.8% more in
Are
interest.
you?
Yes. And so this is
the privilege of being black.
Things are a little more expensive. So, and this isn't just true for small businesses. It's true for mortgage finance. It's true for car finance. It's true for personal loans. And if you think about the root cause of why that happens, it's because when I go to a bank, I'm sitting across the table from a loan officer that's bringing to that encounter all of his conscious and subconscious biases. So rather than evaluate me purely on the merit of the business and the business's ability to pay the loan back, other biases come to play. And this is true not just for, people of color, it's also true for women. So if I'm sitting across the table from Mary and Mary's put together this awesome business plan and she's shown me all of this great revenue and profit growth and cash management in the past, I look at her and I think, this is me from the perspective of a biased loan officer. I look at her and I think, well, I don't know that you really have what it takes, take my money and then, make lemonade out of this, and so what ends up happening is that the people who ought to be getting capital, being creditworthy, qualified people, are not getting the capital. And this turns out to be a bad decision, not just for the borrower, but also for the bank. If the loan officer is making lending decisions based off of anything apart from the merit of the investment opportunity, then that yields a less ideal outcome for the bank because they make less profit, they make less money under that system.
But surely an evaluation would have some human intuition applied to it, some human response.
Oh, absolutely,
right?
Absolutely.
I mean, you have to look at somebody also to a certain extent and say, is this person capable? Are they,
Well,
do we not employ that?
Humans are terrible at that. We
Yes,
do
that's
employ
true.
it. We do employ it, and
Yes.
that's exactly what I'm isolating as the problem.
Yes.
We if you think of this in terms of the weight, maybe 60% of the lending decision or 70% of the lending decision is based off of what's on paper, and then the other. The balance of that is the judgment, the individual judgment of that particular loan officer. And that judgment is where the issue is because they're not particularly good at using that judgment and determining what is the best financial decision for the entity that I represent. And so our solution to that, so I'm going back to my father's point, I think to myself, well, if the root cause of this problem is bias in human decision making, then the solution is essentially to the furthest extent possible, remove the human from the equation and leave this up to a repeatable, scalable equation that looks at the inputs of what you know about a business and then make a determination based off of those inputs. And so at the time I was working at Amazon, so I got together with, what I think are some of the best developers, data scientists in the world.
Fantastic.
And we sought out to build our algorithm. And we did it in a way that I'm really proud of. So we filed a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request with the Small Business Administration. And we asked them for every records on every loan that they backed from year 2000 to 2016.
Oh my God.
This produced 1.2 million records roughly from the Small Business Administration, which they sent us on a CD-ROM.
Did they really?
I appreciate that.
That is hilarious.
I wish it had been a floppy disk. That would have been even better.
CD-ROM. How did you even read it?
So I used one of my really old laptops that I'd stored away that I could still use. So we got this and we enriched the data with information that we had from elsewhere and ran what's called a random forest regression analysis. So that told us among all of these factors that we know about a business and whether or not they're going to pay a loan back, what are the leading determinants on whether someone's going to default on a loan, and not just what are those determinants, but also what is their relative weighting to each other. So, is your number of years in business, is that a 0.5% weighting, or is that a 0.00005% weighting? And then essentially building an equation based off of those insights to then determine whether or not someone will pay us back. So that's how we sought out to remove the human from the equation and make this a data-based decision in terms of who gets financing and who doesn't. And so when I look at the outcomes, in terms of who our borrowers are, the demographics of our borrowers, you start to see that the diligence that went into making the algorithm to begin with, when you compare the profile of who borrows from us and who applies for loans from us, you compare that with sort of the national averages that reflect the bias from the loan officers, you start to see exactly what I'm talking about. And so we think we've developed a really robust and fair way to allocate capital based only on the merit of the business, or to the extent that we can make it only on the merits of the business.
So I'm a small investor. Mm-hmm. Say I have 25 or 50,000. Say I have very little. Say I have $1,000. Can I invest with you?
Yeah, you can.
Why would I trust you?
You would trust me because our existing investors have had such a wonderful experience. It's hard for me to sing my own praises, but if I point you to the people who have experienced what it's like to invest with Good Tree Capital and have experienced what it's like to hand over, $200,000 or $1,000 and see those funds produce returns for them that they then get back into their bank accounts and they can count. That starts to build trust. And then the other reason is because, my goal is not to do this short term. My goal is to create a brand that solves problems for this industry in the long term, and then eventually other industries, particularly as it relates to lending and the various different products under that umbrella. And my personal belief is that the only way to get there is through building a tremendous amount of trust with the people who are enabling me to do that. And frankly, those people are investors. And so to me, they're sacrosanct. Representing their interest and ensuring capital preservation is at the top of our list, which means they not only see their original principal return, but they see returns on top of that principal, is the most important priority at Good Tree Capital.
So to what extent was cannabis involved in the creation of this business? Sort of like,
yeah.
How do you use cannabis, and what I would like to know specifically as it regards to the creation of the business?
Uh-huh. So say more about that when you say the creation of it.
How did you use cannabis to, I don't know, think about it, plan it, enable it,
mm-hmm.
Fund it, start it? I don't know. Deal with your fear of failure about it.
You mean my consumption of cannabis?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. How personally?
Yeah.
What role did it play? How's that for a question?
It's so funny you asked that, because I was just, this was a contentious debate with my father.
I actually think this is the question I need to ask everybody from here on in. It's just...
I am a consumer.
You were talking about with your dad, though.
So this conversation with my dad, he asked...
what's your dad's name?
His name is Frank.
Frank.
He asked, what do I get out of consuming cannabis, and in asking that, he points out the downsides from his perspective of consuming cannabis, particularly smoking cannabis, because he believes no matter what the doctors are saying, we're going to find out later that this is a carcinogen because we are combusting something with fire and inhaling it.
It is confounding. It's absolutely true. It's one of the many confounding things about cannabis, but needless to say.
So he says, given this possible risk, and he's a lung cancer survivor, so he's even more sensitive to it.
He is.
So given this possible risk, what exactly do you get out of it? And my response to him is that, for me personally, and it's different for everybody, but when I consume, I think it sort of unlocks, creativity within me. I wouldn't call myself a finance guy, but I am closer to being a finance guy than I am to being an artist. Someone with any sort of creative inclination. And I have really good ideas when I consume. And so I'm one of those people. If I think something, if I conceive it, then particularly if I think it's a great opportunity, then I put a lot of effort into realizing it, and doing it, putting it into action. And so this was one of the ideas that I had while consuming cannabis. Obviously it didn't sort of happen at one time, but the ability to solve this problem that I'm observing and that I'd learned about from my father, and sort of putting these two together, that was cannabis consumption when that happened. When I was writing my business plan,
It's sort of about when I came upon this idea. It's almost like a synesthesia of the brain. It's like two ideas that don't typically come together do.
Right.
And that really is that is the act of creativity in one way, right? And I think it just enables that somehow.
Yeah. And then the other way I think cannabis plays a role is that it's really easy talking to people about this business. They just seem to understand it on a very sort of simple level. And I think a part of that is, people are more connected to cannabis because lots of people consume it. And so I think they sort of naturally understand, some of the things that are going on once explained to them. They get it more easily almost, because it's one of those industries that's not just abstract for them. It's an industry that they actually engage in.
Yeah, very interesting. So, company's called Good Tree Capital.
Good Tree Capital.
You're called Seke Ballard.
My name is Seke Ballard.
Is that your full name, Seke?
That's my full name.
What's a nice name? Where does it come from?
There are multiple stories on this.
I knew you would have multiple stories on this. Just from this one podcast, I knew there were going to be multiple stories. Choose the best one for us.
Choose the best one. So my uncle did a program similar to Doctors Without Borders in Morocco. And when he came back, my parents were like, "Oh, you've been at this interesting place, name our son." And so he named me Seke. Fast forward 22 years, and I'm serving in the Peace Corps in the Republic of Georgia. And I am located in a town called Batumi, which is the Republic of Georgia's third largest city, and it's right on the border with Turkey. So ton of Turkish people in Batumi. There's a whole Turkish quarter. I'd love to go there and eat food. And every time I would introduce myself to people, they would burst out laughing. Seke, yeah. And they just start laughing. And, I spoke Georgian. They didn't speak great Georgian, didn't speak great English. So it was really hard for me to get a clear idea of why people were laughing at me. So then fast forward another couple of years, I'm in grad school. I have a Turkish classmate who just mispronounces my name all the time, in reference to when we're having class discussions. I always thought, everybody else is pronouncing it correctly. Why isn't she? And so one day she comes up to me after class and she says, "Seke, I'm so sorry that I've been mispronouncing your name, but it's important for me that you know that your name in my language means," am I allowed to say this?
You can say whatever you want. We are a free podcast here. We are free broadcast. Poop.
It means like dick. Like it's just like it's
dick.
Like cunt. Like it's just like a sexual term that's just vulgar sexually.
Oh, really?
So
for everybody.
In Turkish, it just has a very vulgar connotation to it. A vulgar sexual connotation to it. So, my uncle all this times had me believing that my name meant golden violin, but now I don't know what it means.
You know exactly what it means. Thank you for that explanation. I don't know if I'm going to be able to call you that again. Thanks, Seke.
Thanks.
Best of luck, okay?
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Joe and I will continue to publish every episode of the Brave New Weed podcast for free for you, our listeners. But we could always use your support. If you've got a little extra change rattling around in your pocket, you can cruise over to patreon.com/bravenewweed and become a supporter of the show. Everything that you'd pledge to support helps us to increase the guests that we can have on the show, even eventually the frequency of the show. And we have a great set of rewards out there, including copies of Joe's book, invites to special events that we will do in New York City, all sorts of fun things. So if you're enjoying the podcast and you would like to support us, visit patreon.com/bravenewweed today.
What did you think of that interview, Matthew?
I think that this is fascinating. And some of the statistics, I mean, I was just thinking about like my money in my own savings account is not
doing anything.
Yeah, right?
Doing anything?
At all. Like I'm itching already to dig into this because the concept of investment into cannabis space has been front page news now because of the whole Aurora and Canopy Growth deal and everything that's been going on there. A lot of the investment sites are all over the place about like, oh, you got to get it now. And then others are like, don't get it. It's going to collapse because it's not a real thing. And there's tons and tons of uncertainty. But this sounds completely opposite of all of that.
Well, it's vetted. The risk is low. Lending is not a new business. There's nothing really mysterious about this. It obviously hinges on Good Tree's ability to vet good people and make sure that that money is going into organizations that are going to profit and succeed. And I think we have to rely on them to choose well. And I think so far their track record has been great. I've interviewed a few people in this fund because I'm personally interested, and they have all been nothing but thrilled and said that, yes, they are getting 28.7% return over 3 years.
That's crazy. That's crazy.
That's pretty crazy and pretty great. So again, thanks for paying attention. Thanks for listening. Again, this episode was brought to you by Medical Cannabis Mentor, which is an online learning platform for healthcare professionals, dispensary personnel, and soon for patients. So everybody can learn how to do-it-yourself dosing to the right extent with cannabis meds.
In addition to visiting Medical Cannabis Mentor, we do still hope that you will follow, like, subscribe, and share to the Brave New Weed podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We're out there at Brave New Weed. We're nice and easy to find. Always, of course, you can find archives of the show and everything like that at bravenewweed.com. And if you'd like to become a patron of the show, you can visit patreon.com/bravenewweed, where we have bonus content. Patreons get early access to episodes before anyone else. And you can sign up for as little as $1 a month to personally support the show. And we are grateful for anyone who engages with any of those platforms. Also, we are going to begin compiling, as Joe said, this list of sort of product advice and recommendations and sort of like a consumer reports. And so we want to hear from you. Write to us today at bravenewweedcast@gmail.com with your personal experiences with cannabis, what you medicate for, if you're using CBD and you have products that you like, things that have interested you, things that you share with us your personal story, much like I did at the start of the show, because we want then to be able to use that information and share it out with the rest of our listeners as well. Hopefully together we can pool all of our information and put our heads together to come up with a great list of resources for all of us.
I want to add that when you are talking about CBD meds, we do want to know the price. Okay.
Yeah, we want to hear the price.
We do not want medicines that are costing hundreds and thousands of dollars a month. Okay. We're looking at things that people can afford. This is the people's medicine, and we want to make sure that people can afford it. So we want to make sure that there's good manufacturing practices as well as an eye towards consumers.
And if you don't mind, snap a picture of the label and send it to us.
Great idea. We're building this as we go, folks. So bear with us. We think it's great. We think it's a good idea. We know that you, our listeners, are really plugged in and that you are first movers in the space. So we're really going to take your advice very seriously. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you for the next episode of the Brave New Weed podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Brave New Weed podcast. This episode and all future episodes are made possible by amazing listeners like yourself. If you like what you've heard, we encourage you to show your support by giving $1 a month for special access and rewards on patreon.com/bravenewweed. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram via @bravenewweed. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/bravenewweed. And remember, you can always find more information about us or information discussed in each episode by pointing your favorite browser to bravenewweed.com.